John McAllister had always lived a life of solitude on his sprawling ranch in the arid plains of Texas. His days were ruled by the sun and the soil, tending to cattle, mending fences, and navigating the loneliness that settled like dust in every corner of his wooden homestead. Though he was accustomed to the isolation, he was no stranger to the dangers of the land, wild animals, treacherous weather, and the occasional conflict with nearby groups of Native Americans. But John had learned long ago that survival required patience, understanding, and respect for the land and its people. It was during a late afternoon, as the sky was painted with streaks of gold and crimson, that John spotted something unusual from atop the ridge near the river that cut through his property. At first, he thought it was a coyote or a stray calf, common sights in these parts. But as he approached on horseback, a sudden movement caught his eye. Lying amidst the dry brush and rocks was a young girl, barely in her teens, with dark hair streaked with blood. Her breathing was shallow, and the pallor of her skin betrayed severe injury. Something about her stance, or rather, her lack of one, immediately told John that she wasn't just hurt. She was in danger. His first instinct was caution. Stories of Comanche raiding parties and retaliatory attacks ran deep in his mind, tales of entire families wiped out in moments of violence. Yet, as he dismounted and carefully approached, he noticed the fear in her eyes. They were wide, alert, but also pleading. She wasn't attacking, she wasn't threatening, she was human, vulnerable, and desperately in need of help. John examined her quickly. She had multiple shallow cuts along her arms and legs, likely from fleeing through thorny brush. One wound on her side oozed more than the rest. She had clearly been shot at, the bullet grazing her torso. Her clothing, torn and dirt-stained, suggested she had been on the run for some time. Despite the potential risk, John's conscience left him no choice. He carefully lifted her into his arms, noting how fragile she was in his grasp. His own heart pounded not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. The nearest town was miles away, and any delay could mean death for the girl. Back at his ranch, he knew, he could tend to her wounds, give her water and food, and perhaps, just perhaps, keep her alive until she regained enough strength. Riding back, John kept his eyes scanning the horizon. He was painfully aware that leaving her exposed in this wild terrain, even momentarily, could draw attention. He had to move fast, but also quietly. The girl, sensing safety for the first time in days, whispered faintly, "Please, don't let them find me." Though he didn't yet know who they were, he nodded reassuringly. The ranch house itself was a modest wooden structure, surrounded by the sprawling lands John had cultivated over decades. Inside, he laid her gently on a clean blanket in the corner of the main room. He tore strips of his own shirt to clean her wounds, carefully removing the dirt and debris embedded in the cuts. Water from the well was heated over the stove, and with deliberate care, he applied herbal salves his mother had taught him to use as a boy. Every touch, every movement, was guided by a mix of practicality and empathy. He had never treated anyone like this before, not in his life of solitude, but instinct told him that saving her meant more than bandages. It meant trust. As night fell, John built a fire in the hearth. The warmth was comforting, but also necessary, as the girl shivered uncontrollably from blood loss and the chill of the desert night. She spoke little, only enough to let him know her name, Ayoka, a name that rolled off his tongue with a softness that contrasted the harshness of the land outside. Through broken English and gestures, she explained that she had been ambushed while traveling with a small group near the edge of Comanche territory. She had escaped but had been shot in the process. Hours passed, and John watched over her, knowing that any misstep could mean her life. He began to understand that she was not just an injured stranger, she represented a threat of humanity in the midst of a brutal and unforgiving land. Helping her wasn't just an act of compassion. It was an act of courage. Yet, as he drifted into restless sleep, one thought kept gnawing at him. If her pursuers came, would his isolated ranch be enough to protect them both? The first night together was a quiet one. Ayoka slept fitfully, murmuring in her native tongue, while John kept vigil, listening to the wind and the distant cries of coyotes. Though exhausted, he felt an unfamiliar bond forming, a fragile trust built on life and survival. In that silent vigil, he realized that saving her would be no simple act of mercy. It would ignite a conflict that neither of them could yet fully understand. As dawn broke, John resolved to prepare for whatever was coming. He repaired the fences around his property, armed himself with the rifles he kept for hunting, and dug trenches around the perimeter. Primitive defenses, yes, but potentially life-saving. Ayoka, sensing his intent, tried to communicate a warning, pointing to the distant hills where tracks suggested she had been followed. John studied the horizon and understood that the danger looming over them was more significant than mere chance encounters. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying a promise of both peril and destiny. Somewhere out there, 50 warriors were moving silently, tracking the girl he had sworn to protect. And though he did not yet know their intentions, one thing was certain: by finding and saving Ayoka, he had placed himself directly in the path of a storm he could not outrun. That first day, the ranch transformed from a haven of solitude into a crucible of tension where courage and fear intertwined. John McAllister had discovered a wounded Comanche girl, and unknowingly he had set in motion a chain of events that would test his skills, his morality, and his very will to survive. The morning sun rose over John McAllister's ranch with an indifferent brilliance, casting long shadows across the dusty plains. Birds chirped obliviously in the distance, and the cattle lowed softly, unaware that the serenity of the morning was a fragile illusion. Inside his modest wooden home, John moved deliberately, tending to Ayoka as she stirred weakly on the blanket in the corner. Her face bore the marks of pain and fear, but there was also a flicker of determination. Though she had been saved from immediate death, both of them understood that danger lingered just beyond the horizon. John's mind raced as he planned their next steps. He had never faced such a confrontation. The thought of 50 warriors approaching his isolated ranch was enough to make even a seasoned frontiersman's blood run cold. Yet he could not turn Ayoka away. She had trusted him with her life, and that trust became his responsibility. He moved to gather his tools, rifles, and ammunition. Every barrel was cleaned, every bullet checked, and every corner of the ranch examined for potential weaknesses. He knew he had only one advantage: preparation and cunning. Ayoka, now partially recovered from the worst of her wounds, struggled to sit upright. She tried to communicate through gestures and broken words that she understood more than she had let on the night before. John listened carefully, realizing that she could offer insight into the attacker's tactics. "They fast. Many," she muttered, pointing toward the hills beyond the river. Her hands traced a map of the terrain, indicating paths and likely approaches. Though their language barrier was significant, John's instincts told him that her knowledge could be the difference between life and death. For hours, John and Ayoka worked silently together. He repaired fences, reinforcing weak spots with timber and nails. He dug shallow trenches in strategic locations, imagining the approach paths the warriors might take. He set up simple alarms, tin cans tied with ropes that would clatter if anyone crossed certain perimeters. It was crude, yes, but effective in the open, windy plains. Every action he took was calculated to delay, confuse, and protect. While John worked, Ayoka tended to her own recovery as best she could. She applied herbal poultices to her wounds, carefully cleaning and dressing them. She avoided speaking, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, alert to every movement. John noticed that despite her injuries, her body and mind radiated resilience. She was not a passive victim, she was a fighter, shaped by the harsh realities of survival in a world that had tested her before. He could see the way she adjusted her stance when he handed her tools. The way she analyzed the landscape before speaking, a subtle but unmistakable intelligence. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly, and the ranch began to resemble a fortress of desperation. John had arranged hay bales along the main window, creating barricades and stacked barrels near entrances. Each rifle was positioned carefully along the walls, ready to be wielded if necessary. He knew that the approaching warriors would likely move quickly, using stealth and numbers to their advantage. Yet in this temporary haven, John and Ioka held a fragile upper hand. Knowledge of the terrain, preparation, and sheer resolve. As the afternoon wore on, the tension thickened. Every sound of branch snapping, the distant caw of a raven, the shifting of wind through the prairie grass set their nerves on edge. Ioka's eyes were fixed on the hills, and John could see the muscles in her shoulders tightening as if ready to spring into action. Though she had been rescued, the idea of capture or worse remained vivid in her mind. She gestured repeatedly toward the hills, trying to convey urgency. John nodded, silently acknowledging that time was short. By late afternoon, John realized they needed contingency plans beyond the immediate fortifications. If the warriors attacked in force, the ranch could only hold for so long. He instructed Ioka on what to do if a direct confrontation became unavoidable. Stay low, use the interior space for cover, and aim for the element of surprise. He also considered escape routes, noting the river as a potential avenue for fleeing if necessary. Though risky, it might be the only chance to survive an overwhelming assault. Despite the growing tension, John also understood the psychological element of preparation. He spoke to Ioka quietly, offering reassurance. "We've got this," he said. His tone was calm, deliberate, and steady, an anchor in the storm of fear. Though words were limited between them, the sincerity was unmistakable. Ioka nodded, her grip tightening around the small knife she had fashioned from scrap metal, her eyes reflecting a mixture of trust and determination. As evening approached, the first signs of potential danger became evident. Dust rose on the horizon, subtle yet unmistakable, a column of movement, too organized to be wildlife. John squinted against the low sun and made out the forms. A dozen figures moving swiftly along a ridge. Scouts, perhaps, testing the land. His heart pounded, but he maintained composure. He whispered to Ioka, pointing silently toward the approaching threat. They both understood this was no random encounter. 50 warriors were out there, and these were the scouts. John quickly devised a strategy. He decided they would rely on patience and the defensive advantage of the ranch. The scouts could be lured into traps, slowed by the terrain, and picked off one by one if necessary. He also recognized the need for mobility within the house itself. Every room became a defensive position. Windows were reinforced with boards, doors were blocked, and pathways were cleared to allow rapid movement. The ranch, humble as it was, became a tactical stronghold, shaped by desperation and ingenuity. Nightfall brought a chilling wind, and the world outside became a shadowy canvas. John kept a watchful eye through slats in the wooden walls, while Ioka rested as best she could. The distant sounds of movement grew louder, carried by the wind shouts, the clatter of hooves, and the unmistakable rhythm of disciplined pursuit. John's preparation was about to be tested, and both he and Ioka understood that the moment of confrontation would come at first light, when shadows offered cover and every heartbeat counted. In those final hours before night fully claimed the plains, John reflected on the improbable alliance they had formed. A lone rancher and a Comanche girl, thrown together by circumstance, united by survival. Neither could have predicted the bond that had emerged from shared fear and courage, yet it was real. As he adjusted the rifles and checked the barricades one last time, he realized that saving Ayoka was no longer just about compassion, it was about honor, strategy, and the relentless will to confront an approaching storm. The ranch, quiet and tense, stood as a sentinel against the unknown. John and Ayoka, wounded but resolute, waited. The first scouts would arrive soon, and the dance of survival and strategy was about to begin. Every movement, every choice, every breath carried the weight of life or death. In this moment, they were not just a rancher and a girl, they were guardians of each other's destiny, ready to face 50 warriors with nothing but courage, cunning, and the desperate hope that they could endure what was to come. The first chill of dawn crept over the plains, brushing the ranch in a pale, cold light. The wind carried with it the faint scent of dust, sweat, and tension, and every sound seemed amplified in the eerie stillness. John McAllister had slept little, but the fire of vigilance kept him alert. Ayoka, though still weak from her injuries, moved with careful purpose beside him. Both knew that the first encounter was imminent. The scouts had been seen the previous evening, and their presence confirmed a larger threat. 50 warriors moving strategically toward the ranch. John positioned himself at a reinforced window, rifle ready. Each step outside, even for a moment, could expose them to danger. He whispered instructions to Ayoka in simple, clear terms. Stay low, watch the flanks, and follow his lead. Though her English was limited, her understanding was keen. She nodded, her dark eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and determination. There was no room for hesitation. They were about to be tested in ways neither had fully imagined. The first movement appeared on the horizon, a single figure darting across the dry grasses, followed quickly by 3 more. The scouts were small in number but quick, cautious, and deliberate. They approached the ranch in a zigzag pattern, clearly testing for traps and gauging the defenders' readiness. John's pulse raced, yet his hands remained steady. He had prepared for this, and he understood that the first exchange would set the tone for the battle ahead. John aimed carefully and fired a warning shot, not to kill, but to create confusion. The crack of the rifle echoed across the plains, startling the scouts and causing them to momentarily scatter. Ayoka, hidden behind a reinforced corner, watched intently. Though weak, she held the small knife John had fashioned for her, ready to act if necessary. The ranch had become a fortress, and every action was calculated to slow the enemy while minimizing risk to themselves. The scouts regrouped quickly, their movements precise and coordinated. They understood the terrain better than John, but he had the advantage of preparation. Traps set in the tall grass caught the feet of one scout, sending him tumbling and alerting the others to the ranch's defensive measures. A tin can clattered against the wooden fence, and the sound of it ricocheted in the crisp morning air. The scouts hesitated, wary of further traps, and John realized that even small actions could give them crucial seconds. Ayoka's voice, soft but commanding in her native tongue, warned John of a flanking movement. Though he could not understand her words fully, her gestures were unmistakable. She had noticed the enemy attempting to bypass the main line. John moved quickly, adjusting his aim, and fired another shot, this time wounding a scout who had exposed himself. The sight of their companion falling caused a ripple of caution among the others, slowing their advance. The clash was chaotic yet methodical. Each side measured the other, testing for weaknesses and waiting for the opportune moment. The scouts moved with agility, while John and Ayoka used every inch of cover the ranch provided. John realized that despite being outnumbered, their advantage lay in defense, knowledge of the terrain, and the ability to predict movements. He moved with calm precision, issuing silent instructions to Ayoka. When the scouts approach the west side, create noise and misdirect. When they regroup, focus on the center entrance. Hours passed in this tense dance. Dust swirled around the ranch as shots echoed intermittently. Ayoka proved to be an unexpected asset, her awareness of the enemy's tactics allowing John to anticipate movements he might have otherwise missed. Her gestures, subtle but precise, directed him toward hidden approaches the scouts had attempted. It became clear that the girl he had rescued was not merely a passive victim. She was a fighter, shaped by a world where survival demanded constant vigilance and cunning. The scouts began to realize the full extent of the ranch's defenses. Each movement brought them into carefully laid traps, hidden holes, tripwires, and barricades. John and Ayoka, though vastly outnumbered, began to turn the situation to their advantage. A scout attempting to scale the fence was caught by a simple yet effective mechanism, a rope that toppled a barrel in his path. The noise caused confusion, allowing John to aim with precision. Another scout tripped over a hidden spike John had set, incapacitating him long enough to delay the others. Despite their success, the clash was far from over. The scouts retreated briefly to regroup, their shouts carried over the plains as they communicated with a larger force. John knew that this was only the first wave. The main body of 50 warriors was likely positioning itself to strike with full force. He turned to Ayoka, whose gaze was fixed on the distant hills. She pointed, warning him that the main attack would come soon. And John realized that the real test of endurance was about to begin. Night approached once more, casting shadows over the battered but still standing ranch. Both John and Ayoka were exhausted, yet they maintained their vigilance. The scouts had been slowed, but they had also gathered intelligence and would return with reinforcements. Every shot fired, every trap sprung, had been a calculated risk, and both defenders knew that their survival depended on the next confrontation. During the brief lull, John reflected on the unfolding events. He had saved Ayoka's life, but in doing so, he had placed himself directly in the path of conflict. The girl's presence, once a source of vulnerability, had become a source of strength. Together, they had turned a small ranch into a defensive stronghold, and together, they had survived the first wave of scouts. Yet the larger threat remained a force of 50 warriors, coordinated and relentless, ready to test the limits of their endurance. Ayoka, though wounded, moved with determination to check the traps and barricades. She inspected the west flank, pointing out areas that needed reinforcement. John followed her lead, recognizing that her knowledge of the enemy's mindset and tactics was invaluable. They worked silently, the bond between them growing stronger through shared struggle and the unspoken understanding of mutual reliance. By midnight, the ranch was quiet once more. The scouts had withdrawn, leaving behind only the lingering tension of anticipation. John and Ayoka rested in shifts, their eyes never straying too far from the windows. They knew the main attack would come with the dawn, and every moment of rest was precious. In that quiet darkness, they understood the magnitude of what they faced. 50 warriors would not be deterred by barricades alone, and the coming battle would demand every ounce of courage, strategy, and resilience they could muster. As John stared into the night, he felt a mixture of fear and resolve. He had prepared, fought, and survived thus far, but the real test was yet to come. The scouts had only been a warning, a prelude to the storm that approached with the rising sun. And Ayoka, beside him, was no longer just a girl he had rescued. She was his partner in survival, his guide in the unfamiliar terrain of both conflict and trust. Together, they would face the inevitable clash, knowing that the coming dawn would decide whether they would live to see another day. The first light of dawn spilled over the plains, painting the ranch in shades of gold and shadow. The wind had died to a whisper, carrying only the faint scent of dust and gunpowder. John McAllister stood at the window, rifle in hand, his jaw tight with focus. Beside him, Ayoka crouched, her knife within reach, eyes scanning the horizon with a warrior's precision. They both understood that today would decide everything. The scouts had been a warning. Now the main force of 50 warriors was advancing, swift and disciplined, intent on reclaiming the Comanche girl and punishing the lone man who dared interfere. The ranch, now a fortress carved from desperation and ingenuity, braced for the inevitable storm. Barricades of hay bales, barrels, and timber lined the windows. Trenches dug in the surrounding earth provided cover for unexpected movements. John had positioned rifles at strategic points, knowing that every second counted in a fight against superior numbers. Ayoka moved between the defensive positions, checking the alignment of obstacles and adjusting the simple traps they had laid out. Her hands, though small and delicate from a civilian perspective, moved with a lethal efficiency born from survival and instinct out by mid-morning. The dust rose on the horizon, signaling the advance of the Comanche warriors. John counted them through the haze, a formidable force, mounted on agile horses, weapons ready, eyes fixed on the ranch. Their approach was methodical, disciplined, a stark contrast to the scattered scouts of the previous day. He felt a surge of adrenaline but forced himself to breathe slowly. Panic would be fatal. Precision and strategy were their only chance. The first volley of arrows flew through the air, dark against the pale sky. John fired back, targeting the nearest mounted figures, while Ayoka used the chaos to her advantage, creating diversions and misdirecting the attackers. Each shot, each movement, was a delicate balance between offense and defense. The clash was immediate and violent, echoing across the plains. Dust and debris exploded around the barricades as arrows struck wood and stone. The sound of splintering timber mingling with the cries of men and horses. The warriors dismounted in part, attempting to scale the fences, seeking a breach in the makeshift defenses. John's rifles were relentless, picking off attackers who exposed themselves, while Ayoka worked silently, her small frame maneuvering through the interior of the house to intercept anyone who got too close. She moved with lethal grace, wielding her knife with a combination of skill and desperation that belied her age and injuries. Together, they formed an unpredictable duo, one providing lethal range support, the other striking with precision at close quarters. Hours dragged on, each moment stretched by the tension of life and death. John could feel the strain on his body, muscles screaming, nerves taut, yet he forced himself to remain calm. He knew that any lapse, any hesitation, could allow the warriors to overrun the ranch. Ayoka's presence, a combination of insight and courage, was invaluable. She signaled silently when she spotted weaknesses in the enemy formation, guiding John's shots and movements. Their bond, forged in the crucible of survival, had transformed into an unspoken communication that transcended language. The warriors adapted quickly, learning from the initial losses inflicted by John and Ayoka. They attempted flanking maneuvers, sending small groups to test the defenses from unexpected angles. John anticipated this, having mapped potential approaches and prepared countermeasures. Traps were sprung strategically, catching horses and men alike, creating chaos in the ranks of the attackers. The scent of dust, sweat, and blood mingled in the hot morning air, a visceral reminder of the stakes of this brutal engagement. Despite their superior numbers, the warriors began to hesitate. John's precise fire, combined with Ayoka's agile interventions, slowed their advance. Each attempt to breach the ranch was met with resistance that seemed disproportionate to the small size of the defenders. They could not understand the terrain, the traps, or the fierce determination driving this unlikely alliance of man and girl. Fear and frustration began to ripple through their ranks. By afternoon, the battle had reached a crescendo. Arrows had pierced walls, splintered wood, and scraped skin, yet the ranch held firm. John and Ioka were exhausted, sweat mingling with grime, muscles screaming from relentless exertion. Yet they did not yield. Every glance, every breath, every shot, and every movement was deliberate. They were not fighting merely to survive, they were fighting to protect each other, to assert their will against overwhelming odds, to defy the inevitability of death that hovered like a shadow over the plains. At one critical moment, a small group of warriors breached the outer fence. John's heart pounded as he fired, dropping one attacker. Ioka lunged at another, her knife flashing in the sun, cutting him down with decisive efficiency. The clash of combat rang out, a brutal symphony of survival. In that instant, the synergy between the two defenders was undeniable. Neither relied solely on instinct. Each movement was informed by trust and understanding. Their actions, though improvised, were devastatingly effective against an enemy unprepared for such coordination from so few. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the battlefield, the momentum shifted. The warriors, seeing the futility of repeated frontal assaults and the mounting losses, began to withdraw slowly. They retreated in an organized manner, signaling the end of this initial siege, though it was clear they would return if John and Ioka survived. The ranch, battered and scarred, stood victorious, but the victory was tempered by exhaustion, bloodied hands, and the realization that this was only the first true test of endurance. John and Ioka, bruised, bloodied, yet unbroken, took a moment to breathe, assessing the aftermath. The ranch had held, but they both knew the larger threat, the full force of 50 warriors, remained a looming danger. Yet in this hard-won respite, they also recognized their own strength, their resilience, and the profound bond that had emerged from shared struggle. They were no longer merely a rancher and a girl. They were defenders, comrades, and partners in survival. Night fell, bringing a fragile calm. The plains outside seemed empty, yet every shadow and whisper of wind reminded them that the danger had only been delayed, not eliminated. John cleaned and reloaded his rifles, while Ioka attended to minor wounds, both their bodies aching but their spirits resolute. They knew that tomorrow could bring another wave, but for tonight they had survived together, a testament to courage, ingenuity, and unyielding determination. In the quiet of the evening, John realized that the bond between them had transformed from necessity to trust, and perhaps, in some fragile way, to respect and friendship. The girl he had saved had proven herself to be more than capable, more than resilient, and together they had turned the ranch into a symbol of defiance against overwhelming odds. As the fire crackled and shadows danced across the walls, both knew that the battle had been won for the moment, but the war for survival was far from over. The sun rose slowly over the scarred plains, painting the aftermath of the battle in muted gold and shadow. The air was thick with dust, the smell of gunpowder lingering alongside the earthiness of trampled grass and churned soil. John McAllister and Ioka stood side by side on the veranda of the battered ranch, surveying the consequences of the previous day's conflict. The fortress-like home they had fortified had survived, but barely. Splintered wood and broken barrels littered the grounds, and scorch marks on the walls testified to the intensity of the engagement. Yet amidst the destruction, both felt an undeniable sense of triumph, not just for survival, but for the bond that had been forged in fire. Ioka, still fragile from her injuries, moved carefully across the porch. Her dark eyes scanned the horizon, ever alert. Though the main body of the Comanche warriors had withdrawn, she knew they had not vanished. John had observed the same tension in the distant hills, an unspoken threat that the conflict was not yet over. But for now, the immediate danger had passed. The scouts and warriors had been forced to retreat, unable to overcome the ingenuity, courage, and sheer resolve of two determined defenders. For the first time in days, Ayoka allowed herself to relax, leaning slightly against the wooden railing, feeling the warmth of the morning sun on her skin. John, observing her carefully, felt a mixture of relief and reflection. They had survived together, not by chance, but through meticulous planning, instinct, and a growing trust that transcended language. He realized that the experience had changed him. The isolation he had once cherished now seemed less vital than the connection he had formed with this young girl, a bond born of mutual dependence and shared danger. In protecting Ayoka, he had discovered a part of himself that he had long kept buried, the capacity to care deeply, to act selflessly, and to trust in another's courage as much as his own. The two moved inside the ranch, tending to the aftermath. John patched holes in the walls, reinforced barricades, and prepared a small supply of food and water. Ayoka, though weak, assisted in organizing what they had salvaged, her nimble fingers skillful at practical tasks. There was an unspoken rhythm to their work, a silent acknowledgement that the events of the past days had irrevocably linked their fates. She gestured occasionally, pointing to areas that still needed repair, and John nodded, grateful for her insight. Her presence had become invaluable, not merely as someone he had saved, but as a partner in survival and strategy. As the day progressed, a cautious calm settled over the plains. John knew that the warriors would not abandon their pursuit entirely, but the immediate threat had passed. He decided it was time to consider their next steps. Remaining isolated at the ranch indefinitely would only invite further danger. Yet leaving the familiar land of home carried its own risks. Together, they weighed their options through gestures, broken words, and shared understanding. The choice before them was stark: remain and risk another assault, or venture into the unknown, seeking safety and a chance at a life unshackled by fear. Ayoka, despite her injuries, showed remarkable resolve. Her gestures indicated a desire to leave, to move beyond the plains and the shadow of her pursuers. John, though hesitant, recognized the wisdom in her intuition. The land had been their battleground, but it could not remain their sanctuary. He prepared supplies, packed what could be carried, and ensured that weapons and essentials were ready. The trust between them, solidified in the heat of battle, now extended to decisions that would shape their future. They had survived the immediate threat, but their journey was far from over. Before setting out, John took a moment to reflect on the people who had shaped their experience. The Comanche warriors, formidable and disciplined, had been adversaries, yet they were also a reminder of the harsh realities of life on the frontier. Ayoka herself embodied resilience, courage, and resourcefulness, qualities that had ensured their survival. John felt a deep respect for her, not merely for her strength, but for her unyielding spirit in the face of unimaginable danger. He realized that their partnership had become a fusion of survival instinct and mutual respect, an alliance that neither could have foreseen but both had embraced fully. As evening approached, they prepared to leave the ranch, their destination uncertain but their purpose clear. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that stretched across the plains, and the wind carried with it the scent of freedom and uncertainty. John led the way, rifle slung over his shoulder, while Ayoka followed closely, knife at the ready, her eyes alert for any sign of danger. Each step was deliberate, cautious, yet infused with determination. They were leaving behind more than a home. They were leaving behind the isolation of the past and stepping into a shared destiny forged in adversity. The journey ahead was fraught with uncertainty. The plains stretched endlessly before them, dotted with hidden dangers and unpredictable elements. Yet John and Ioka moved with confidence born of experience and trust. Each obstacle, be it natural terrain or potential threats, was met with calm pragmatism and the knowledge that together they could confront whatever challenges arose. The lessons learned during the siege had prepared them for a world where survival demanded constant vigilance, courage, and cooperation. As night fell, they made camp beneath a stand of trees, the stars above a silent witness to their resilience. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow on their weary faces. For the first time since the ordeal began, they allowed themselves a moment of reflection and quiet reprieve. The bonds between them, forged in fire and blood, had deepened into an unspoken promise to protect, to endure, and to face whatever came next together. John knew that their journey was only beginning, and that the decisions they made now would shape not only their survival but the essence of their lives. In that tranquil night, a sense of hope emerged alongside the exhaustion. The battle had tested them, the warriors had challenged them, and the frontier had demanded everything they could give. Yet through courage, strategy, and trust, John and Ioka had prevailed. The ranch, scarred but intact, stood as a testament to their determination. More importantly, their partnership had evolved into a shared purpose, a bond that transcended the perils of the land and the divisions of culture. They had chosen life, resilience, and each other over fear, isolation, and defeat. As dawn approached on the following day, they rose from their makeshift camp, ready to continue their journey. The plains stretched before them like a vast canvas of possibilities. Though the memory of battle lingered, it no longer defined them. John McAllister and Ioka had survived the siege, faced overwhelming odds, and emerged stronger, wiser, and bound by trust. Together, they would navigate the unknown, forging a path defined not by fear or circumstance, but by courage, resourcefulness, and the unbreakable bond between two souls who had chosen to survive and thrive together.